Great. All right. Hello. Good evening, everyone. My name, like was just said, like is on the screen behind me, is Kate Kunkel-Patterson. I am a park ranger for the National Park Service. I'm an interpretive park ranger, so that means I work to tell stories, talk about history and natural resources and all these things. I grew up here in the Pacific Northwest, but my career with the National Park Service has taken me to the south, to the southeast, to the mid-Atlantic, to the Midwest, all with these National Park Service jobs. And I came back here to Washington in 2020, and as Gruber mentioned, I did graduate from Whitman College, and so coming back to Walla Walla was extra fun. Yeah. Like I said, I work for the National Park Service, so this is an agency many of you may be familiar with for places such as these, the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, and Yellowstone National Park. Anyone been to any of those places? Show of hands. Cool. Me too. And yes, the National Park Service protects and preserves these amazing natural wonders. However, the National Park Service does so much more. There's over 400 National Park Service sites spread out across the country, as well as in territories. And over 400 places that this agency, people dressed in the same uniform as me, we all take care of these places. And the majority of these 400 plus sites actually have to do with the history and the culture of this country. The cultures that make up the United States. So places that would include the Statue of Liberty in New York, Gettysburg National Battlefield over in Pennsylvania, right? These are all national park sites. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And, you guessed it, Whitman Mission. Yes, exactly. One of these 400 plus units of the National Park Service is Whitman Mission National Historic Site. As many of you may know, we are quietly tucked about 6 miles outside of Walla Walla, so very close to here. And this is where I work as an interpretive park ranger day in, day out. So 5 days a week, I'm here working there, talking to people, telling those stories. And the present day park that you're seeing like a small image of, has anyone been there? Has everyone been there? But the present day park, it sits on land that has been home to Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla families for thousands of years. So the history that we work to tell there is complex, it's got lots of nuance, and it's very, very relevant to the time we're in right now. So I'm going to read to you the official purpose statement for Whitman Mission National Historic Site. So this is kind of like an administrative guide for why this park exists. And so that is as follows. I'll read it aloud, but it's also on the screen behind me. At Whitman Mission National Historic Site, the National Park Service is entrusted with preserving a sacred piece of Wailepu homeland, interpreting the tragic events surrounding the early 19th century Christian mission, memorializing those who died here, promoting a deeper understanding of the lasting impact of this history, and seeking to heal the associated trauma together with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. So, that is, like I said, the official purpose of the park, of Whitman Mission, where I work 5 days a week. And today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at this history. I'm going to bring you with me as I briefly outline the basics of what was happening on that little patch of land in the 1830s and 40s. Some of you, many of you may be really familiar with that history, but some of you might not be. So we're going to go over a brief background so we all have the same context. And then after we get that context, we're going to look at the popular legacy that exists surrounding Marcus Whitman, and we're going to contrast that popular legacy with his own actions and words. And this is going to prompt us to ask this question that's going to guide us through this talk. And this question is, how can a person's legacy blind us to the truth of their actions, to the truth of their life, to the truth of their choices? So I'll say that one more time. This guiding question, as I was putting this together, is how can a person's how can a person's legacy blind us to the truth of their actions, their life, or their choices? So without further ado, we'll dive in. Like I said, this is going to be a quick overview. This is not giving you all of the details. It's a very, very complex history, and I'm just giving you guys like the nutshell version of this, right? So we all have that same background as we dive in. And we will be going back into this into a little bit more detail after we get the big picture overview. So let's start off with the residents. The residents, and I mean in terms of the long term, right? So for thousands of years, families have been living in this area that we call Walla Walla, the town of Walla Walla today. These are Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla families, some of whom are pictured up behind me. In addition to Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla families who've been living in and with this place for thousands of years, there are other Columbia River Plateau tribes who are in the near vicinity, coming and going, overlapping with Cayuse, Walla Walla, Umatilla families who are more directly in this area. And we like to think of the residents in terms of the long view, right? People who have been here for thousands of years, or whose ancestors have been here for thousands of years, and whose descendants will be here thousands of years from now. So this is how we frame the residents. Not just someone who happens to be here right now. I've lived here since 2020. I'm a resident of Walla Walla. We're talking residents in the large scale, right? So we have the residents. Next, we have the newcomers. The newcomers are Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. These are Americans. They're from upstate New York in the United States, and they're Presbyterian missionaries. Marcus Whitman is a doctor by training, so he's a doctor back east. And Marcus and Narcissa Whitman have kind of a quick marriage of convenience. They would not send single missionaries out, so they both wanted to be missionaries. They got married, and out they come as missionaries. They're funded to do this missionary work in Oregon country by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. It's a really long title, so we like to shorten it to ABCFM, which is also a really long shortening. You can see we've got some of their charter and bylaws up here on the screen. So the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. They fund Marcus and Narcissa Whitman's Presbyterian missionary effort. And a quick but important thing to note here is that the ABCFM only sent missionaries outside of the United States, outside of the boundaries of the United States at that time, okay? It's really easy for us to just assume, oh, you know, we're in the United States today, this has always been U.S. land. No, that is absolutely not the case. The ABCFM only sent people to foreign lands outside of the country, and so one of the things we like to remind people is for the entirety of the time the Whitmans are out here in what is today the Walla Walla Valley, they were outside the boundaries of the United States at that time. Okay, so they were funded by a group that only sent people to foreign lands. They were here, they weren't within the boundaries of their country. The Whitmans are not the first or the only newcomers to this area. Right? They're also joined by Hudson's Bay Company, so trappers and traders. They're joined by other missionaries. There are Methodists in this, you know, broadly speaking, this area. There are other Presbyterians. There's the Spaldings, there's the Walkers. Later there'll be the Elses. There's also the Métis community. Anyone been to Frenchtown? Yeah, you can learn a lot about the Métis community at Frenchtown. Those families, you know, that site talks about those Frenchtown, or those Métis families. Additionally, there are Catholic priests out here doing missionary work for the Catholic Church. So the Whitmans aren't the only people here that Cayuse and Walla Walla people are interacting with. So we've got the residents, we have our newcomers. Let's talk about the what. The what is a mission. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman arrive here in 1836. Cayuse leaders are really curious about these newcomers, and so the Whitmans are given permission to live on a small subset of Cayuse land. It's where the park sits today, so it's about 6 miles from where we are right now. And again, I'll reiterate, this is not United States land. The mission is there for 11 years, and for the entirety of that time, it's not U.S. land. Okay? Once they arrive in 1836, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman really focus on building a mission. They focus on agriculture, so cultivating fields, growing food. And they are also focused on religion, specifically, like I said earlier, Presbyterianism. That was their vein of Christianity that they were missionaries for. Once they arrive in 1836, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman really focus on building a mission. They focus on agriculture, so cultivating fields, growing food. And they are also focused on religion, specifically, like I said earlier, Presbyterianism. That was their vein of Christianity that they were missionaries for. But in addition to thinking about religion and this like religious missionary work, the Whitmans are really, really focused on lifestyle. So they're interested in changing Cayuse spirituality, that's that religious missionary part, but they're also really curious and interested in changing Cayuse lifestyle. So these would include examples like encouraging Cayuse families to live in one place all year round instead of moving throughout a vast homeland. This would include changes, the Whitmans were asking Cayuse families to speak and read and write in English, right? So lifestyle changes as well as those religious changes. Like I said, the mission is there for 11 years. This is the only image we have of the Whitmans' mission during the time. Someone whose eyeballs were actually there drew this. And about halfway through that 11-year time period where the mission is there and it's active, Oregon Trail immigration begins. And this would continually increase. So in the early 1840s, immigration on the Oregon Trail kicked off. And it would increase through the end of the mission. This Oregon Trail immigration started a shift in focus and a shift in purpose for the missionaries, for Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. And that's what we're going to dive into more once we finish this overview. So if this is the what, it brings us to the end of the mission, culmination of years of tension, frustration. The missionaries were asked to leave more than once. And then in the fall of 1847, there was a measles outbreak. And the culmination of all of these things and more, again, this is a really complex history, and I'm giving you guys a brief overview. The culmination of this was an attack on the mission by a small group of Cayuse men in late November of 1847. This attack on the mission killed 13, including Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, but there were about 50 people who were there who were not killed in the attack. After the attack, the mission is abandoned, and news begins to spread, and people back east in the United States, people in the Willamette Valley, they're starting to react. There's this chain reaction in the United States, and it leads to the creation of Oregon Territory. Later that would become the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and parts of Wyoming and Montana. This chain reaction would later lead to wars between the U.S. military and the militias and the Cayuse people, like the Cayuse War, and then spiraling wars that were spreading as well. This led to treaties, treaty negotiations, and more, right? So we have these massive implications coming from this event that took place in 1847. So again, that's the big picture. You guys have stuck through the summary. Now that we all have those basics, we're going to dive deeper into the details and the legacy. So most often, Marcus Whitman is remembered primarily as a missionary. Right? Sometimes we hear the word martyr thrown in there with how he's remembered, what his legacy is. Sometimes we hear the word pioneer, sometimes we hear the word doctor, and some others as well. Oftentimes he's remembered in likenesses such as the one that's up on the screen behind me. This statue, the image of this statue here, you can see one of these statues in downtown Walla Walla if you're curious. But since I've been working at Whitman Mission, part of my job is to be very, very familiar with the history surrounding the Whitmans and surrounding the history that took place there at Whitman Mission. So being really familiar with the Whitmans and the events that took place, knowing a lot about this history, knowing a lot about this person who's represented in the statue behind me, it's led me to kind of puzzle over the ubiquity of Marcus Whitman's legacy in this popular sense, right? Martyr, missionary, doctor, pioneer. So when getting into the choices, the words, and the actions of Marcus Whitman, part of my job, right, learn about the person, a really different image began to emerge for me. One that usually is not included in this popular legacy, right? This legacy that maybe we hear in school books or, in these big, broad cultural ways. And so I want to introduce the idea to you guys of Whitman, the businessman, not the missionary. That's what we're going to explore. So I want to backtrack just a little before the end of the mission, before the attack on the mission, we're going to backtrack to the year 1842. This is really close to when Oregon Trail immigration was kicking off and really getting started. In 1842, Marcus Whitman travels back to the United States. So he leaves here, he travels back to the United States to plead with the ABCFM, the funding board for his mission. He's going to plead with them to continue funding the missions in Oregon Country because they threatened to take away the funding. If you want to read something really entertaining, you'll read the letters between the missionaries and the American board when they're kind of bickering with each other. It's pretty petty, and like you can read it now and be like, oh man, there were a lot of strong personalities in that room. But the missionary board says, we're not going to fund you guys. It's not working. So Marcus Whitman travels back east to petition the board to continue funding these missions in Oregon Country. Marcus Whitman is successful in this petition. The board says, yes, we will keep funding these missions in Oregon Country. So he travels back to Washington, or to the United States, the winter of 1842 and into 1843. So he travels back, he leaves here late 1842, he arrives there 1843, and then in the spring of 1843, Marcus Whitman is preparing to travel back out here, right? He's got to get back. He's got to tell the good news the missions are going to keep getting funding. He's preparing to travel back to Oregon Country with a pre-planned Oregon Trail immigration out here. With a pre-planned wagon train. But before he leaves, he has one more meeting with the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, with his funding group. And in this meeting with the American Board, we start to see the beginnings of a really critical, really crucial shift in Marcus Whitman's focus and in the purpose for Whitman and his mission out here in Oregon, or in Oregon Country. So, spring of 1843, it's actually April of 43, he's getting ready to travel back out here. He has this meeting with the ABCFM, and he asks the board, the ABCFM, to send with him an ordained man. Marcus Whitman was not an ordained minister. He was just a missionary, not an ordained minister. So he's asking the board to send an ordained man out with him so that Marcus could be relieved of his religious duties. Marcus Whitman references the demands that the immigrants, the Oregon Trail immigrants, would make as a justification for this ask. So what we can see in that ask, in that meeting, is Marcus is kind of starting to think about shifting his purpose for him and for his mission. He's shifting it away from missionary work, hence asking for an ordained man, and shifting towards supporting Oregon Trail immigration. Now, the board does not send an ordained man with them. They deny that request, and they say, okay, no, go on ahead. So for the rest of 1843, Marcus Whitman travels out with the group, no ordained man with them. He guides this group, this Oregon Trail immigration, past his mission, past the Whitman mission site, and as they're going past, he's selling foodstuffs and other supplies to Oregon Trail immigrants in that wagon train in 1843. That year, in 1843, Whitman actually oversells food supplies. So he leaves not enough in the mission stores to last him through the winter. So he's really eager, he's selling all this supplies to the point where he oversells. And the Whitmans actually had to rely on other missionaries to help them out with their food supplies over the winter of 43 into 44. In 1844, we see the shift in focus and purpose for the mission really solidify. So Marcus Whitman notes the amount of food he sold to immigrants in the immigration of 43. He also notes how much food he was short the winter of 44. Marcus Whitman takes these observations and he begins to plan better for 1844 and that Oregon Trail immigration. Because Oregon Trail immigrants would leave the east in the spring, but they wouldn't arrive out here until the fall. So he had some time to plan, get his infrastructure. In this planning, he plants way more potatoes and garden vegetables than he had previously. Because he's noting, okay, I sold this much to immigrants, right? And we were short, so we need more. So he's planting more of these garden vegetables. Marcus Whitman rebuilds a burned grist mill. A grist mill is something that takes dried corn and grinds it into cornmeal, or wheat into flour. He's rebuilding this grist mill to prepare for the 1844 immigration and the need for cornmeal and flour from Oregon Trail immigrants. And Whitman writes about his shift in purpose. He writes about it to a fellow missionary. I'll read this aloud. So in May of 1844, Marcus Whitman writes to a fellow missionary, "I do not know how much longer we shall be called upon to operate for the benefit of the Indians." He writes about this shift in focus to his supervisor at the ABCFM, Reverend Green. To his supervisor in May of 1844, he writes, "Indeed, I am fully convinced that when a people refuse or neglect to fill the designs of Providence, they ought not to complain at the results. The Indians have in no case obeyed the command to multiply and replenish the earth, and they cannot stand in the way of others doing so." Marcus Whitman also writes about this shift in his own focus and purpose to his in-laws, to Narcissa Whitman's parents. He writes in 1844, "It does not concern me so much what is to become of any particular set of Indians. I have no doubt our greatest work is to be to aid the white settlement of this country." What we can see from these three quotes in Marcus Whitman's words is he's beginning to really solidify. He's focusing more and more on his business, on helping and assisting Oregon Trail immigrants, while that other part of his job out here, the missionary work to Cayuse and Walla Walla people, is being left by the wayside. The grist mill's back to full strength in 1844, and Whitman was able to charge immigrants on the Oregon Trail the following prices for flour and cornmeal during that immigration of 1844. So we have cost per 100 pounds. So this is what you would pay if you were buying 100 pounds of the following things. And real quick, bolted and unbolted. Unbolted is a lower quality, bolted is a higher quality, hence the price difference. So for 100 pounds of lower quality or unbolted flour, Marcus Whitman was charging $5. Steal of a deal. For the higher quality flour, for 100 pounds, he was charging $6. This is in 1844. For unsifted or the lower quality cornmeal, it was $4 for 100 pounds. And for sifted or higher quality cornmeal, it was $5 for 100 pounds of cornmeal. I don't know about you guys, but I don't know what $1844 mean in today's money, so I translated these into $2024 for comparison. So real quick, translated into $2024, the same amount of unbolted flour would be $209. The same amount of the higher quality flour would be $251. The lower quality cornmeal is $167, and then the higher quality is $209. But again, I don't buy quantities of cornmeal or flour at this amount. I don't buy 100 pounds of flour at the same time. I do like to use flour, but I don't buy 100 pounds at the same time. So this got me wondering, what would 100 pounds of flour cost, like from a grocery store today? So if we were to purchase, and I just took like an average grocery store price for a 5-pound bag of flour and I multiplied it out. Average cost of 100 pounds of flour from a grocery store in 2024 would be about $115. So this behind me gives us a little bit of an idea of his business. Okay? He was really successful in 1844. Marcus Whitman is selling a lot of cornmeal and flour to these Oregon Trail immigrants. And these successful sales in 1844 moved Marcus Whitman further from doing his missionary work and more towards that businessman, right? Remember, I was introducing you guys to Marcus Whitman, the businessman. He reinforces this shift in a letter to the ABCFM, to his bosses, in the spring of 1845. He says, "Situated as we are, necessity compels us to become suppliers to immigrants, and we may as well make the best of it we can." So that's again to his bosses at the missionary board in 1845. But But little did Marcus Whitman know a change was ahead in that year's immigration. 1845 would be the first immigration on a, quote, new path, or a new route to the Columbia River, and that new route took people through the Umatilla River Valley, where present-day Pendleton, Oregon is. This new route through the Umatilla Valley is about 40 miles south of where we are, of where Whitman's mission is. And most immigrants in the immigration in 45 took that more southerly route, and fewer took that 40-mile, at least 3 days travel, detour up to Whitman's mission. And so what does Marcus Whitman do? Well, what any businessman would do, he says, all right, people aren't coming to me, I'm going to go to these people. So Whitman packs up a wagon with supplies, with flour, the cornmeal, the potatoes, all that stuff, and he travels to the Umatilla Valley, and he travels to the Grand Ronde Valley. He goes to where Oregon Trail immigrants are, and he's going to go meet with them to sell supplies there. But like any businessman, right, this is Business 101, Marcus Whitman changes his prices. He marks his prices up to include the cost of his trouble, right, his travel. So on the screen, I just took one example. So we're just going to look at unbolted flour. That's that lower quality flour. So what Marcus Whitman was charging for 100 pounds of unbolted flour at his mission was $5. What he was charging when he went to the Umatilla Valley for the same amount, the same flour, was $8. It's a $3 difference. But again, what is that difference in today's dollar, right? How can we relate to it? What does that mean for us today? So in 1845, it's a $3 difference. In 2024 dollars, this $3 difference would be a difference of about $115. So it's a pretty big markup, right? Again, this is not to say that this markup was bad or wrong or not the right move. It's just simply to illustrate that this is solidly putting him in the arena of business. Like, this is what he's focusing on. After the successes of 1845, I think the batteries just died. Hold on. They warned me at the start the batteries were low. Alright, you guys hear me? Alright, cool. So, after he's successful in 1845, he's traveling to the Oregon Trail to sell these supplies. Some people are still coming to his mission to purchase supplies as well. But Marcus Whitman continues to justify this change in purpose to his bosses, right? To various people in 1846. And Marcus Whitman actually gets a little bit of pushback from some of those bosses at the American Board in 1846. Now, a quick note here before I go into this next quote, and that is that mail in the 1840s, the post, mailing letters took a long time. It took an average of a year for a letter to get from here back to the East Coast, back to the United States, and then it might take another year for a letter from the East, from the U.S. to get out here. So mail took a while. So this next quote I'm about to show and read to you guys is a letter from 1846, but it's responding to a letter in 1844. Okay? Yeah. So just a quick note there. So Marcus Whitman, he continues to justify this switch, this change in focus, this change in his purpose, and he gets a little bit of pushback from the American Board of Commissioners. So this letter is from 1846, but it's in response to those letters from 44 and 45. And I'll read it aloud. This is a long one. Reverend Green from the American Board says to Marcus Whitman, "We are glad to hear of your prosperity in secular matters, and that you may be able, by means of your grain and your stock, to defray a large part of your expenses. All this is well. Still, we are not quite sure that you ought to devote so much time and thought to feeding the immigrants, and thus make your station a great restaurant." It's his italics, not mine. "A great restaurant for the weary pilgrims on their way to their promised land. Such a work is very humane and good work, but the work of guiding men to Christ is a better one, and coincides better with the vocation of a missionary laborer. We fear the effect of this on your own mind and heart, that you will become too exclusively a man of business. And upon the Indians, that they will have their thoughts engrossed about improving their outward condition, while they will be led to think their spiritual interests are of little consequence. There is danger also that your mission, like that of the Methodists, will get the name and character of a trading or money-making establishment, and thus bring discredit not only on your own station or mission, but on the missionary work generally. All right. Give me 1 second. I'm find myself. So, what we see from this is Reverend Green and the larger American Board, the funding organization for the Whitman's mission, they don't approve of this decision, and they're telling him that, right? They're saying, we don't think this is the right path, you know? Focus a little bit more on the missionary work. But Marcus Whitman does continue down the business path. This shift continues in 1846, and by the fall of 1846, the Oregon Trail immigration is smaller, and Marcus Whitman is left with more supplies. He doesn't sell off quite as much as he did in 1844 or 1845. So he's left with unsold supplies, and he's disappointed because he's really trying to get his mission to be self-supporting financially. And he's not able to do that in 1846 because there's just less people going by that year. Reasons for the smaller immigration of 1846 might be the Applegate Trail. If you're really familiar with Oregon Trail stuff, this is going to be ringing bells. It might be the trail to California. And there were other side routes that travelers were taking that took them further from the Whitman's mission, further from these supplies that he was offering. So in 1846, he's still continuing this work. These activities continue into 1847. And the shift in purpose throughout these couple of years that we've been kind of diving into depth on, the early 1840s, this shift in Marcus Whitman's purpose doesn't sit well with the ABCFM, as we saw, and it doesn't sit well with all of the Cayuse people in the vicinity. But the sales of food, the support, these continue, the supplies continue. In the early fall of 1847, as that immigration is starting to come through this area, measles arrives that year with the immigration. And after 11 years here, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman lived here in this area for 11 years. We see this shift in their purpose, in their focus, in what they were doing. After 11 years, after various tensions, a lot of warnings, after the shift in the purpose of the mission, this culminates in the attack on the mission that happened in late November of that year, of 1847. The attack and the implications we touched on earlier, right, in the big broad overview. But those the implications of the attack, it leads to a forever changed place here where we are now. However, Marcus Whitman's shift in purpose in Cayuse Country is a distinct pivot. It's a point in history we can put our finger on, right? We can identify this pivot, this change. Marcus Whitman both shows and tells people that he is moving away from this missionary work, his stated purpose here as a missionary. He's moving away from that among Cayuse people, and he's instead focusing his time and his energy, his efforts, on aiding and supplying and being, a business to support and supply these Oregon Trail immigrants. So my question is, why don't we listen to him? Right? Why don't we take Marcus Whitman's own words into account when we think about his legacy? His mission changed, right? His mission, his purpose here changed, but his legacy is still unchanged. We never think about his business or him as a businessman when we think about the legacy of Marcus Whitman, of the Whitman mission. Like we talked about earlier today, many Americans still think of Whitman in this way, right? This statue here. Like we talked about earlier, most people think of his legacy as a missionary. Some people will throw in the words pioneer, martyr, doctor, right? Those get thrown around a lot. But why not businessman? That's what he was. He was telling people at the time that that's what he was focusing on, and that's what he was was shifting towards. So what I hope is by diving a little deeper, this exploration into Whitman's shift in purpose, his shift in focus, his shift in goals, this shift halfway through his time in Cayuse Country, it can add another layer into this broader or popular perception of Marcus Whitman. It can add another layer into how we think about his legacy. It can add another layer into how we understand what was going on here in the 1830s and 40s and how it's still impacting us. So as we wrap up, we're going to wrap up in just a few minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions if you have any. But as we wrap up, I want to challenge you all. I want to challenge each of you to reevaluate your understanding of people and events of the past, like Marcus Whitman, right? And I want to challenge you to reevaluate people, events, history, things that happened in the past, or people, historical actors of past years. I would encourage you to reevaluate it with this question in mind. This is the question that we started with. How might a person's legacy blind us to the truth of their actions, life, or choices? How might a person's legacy blind us to the truth of their choices, actions, and life? I'll conclude just by saying thank you. Thanks to Fort Walla Walla for having me. And I would encourage you to visit Whitman Mission if you haven't been there recently. I work there, so you can come visit me. But you can see how the National Park Service is expanding how this history is told. If you come out to the mission, how we tell the story on site, to include more perspectives, to include these more layers, right? To include more ways for people to think deeply about these events and the people who are contributing to the events, and to make this history more complete and more whole. So with that, I'll say thank you again, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer any of those.
How did the ABCFM money get to the Whitmans? It wasn't a wire transfer, I'm sure.
Yeah, good question. I think it's a good question. I think they used lines of credit, specifically through like the Hudson's Bay Company,
Okay.
which is where the Whitmans were purchasing most of their stuff from anyway. I'd have to check to be 100% certain, so don't quote me on that, but if memory serves, I think that's how they were doing the financial backing. Good question. I saw a couple other people. Yeah, here.
Wasn't another significant purpose for him to leave in the fall, which was very risky, to urge because did he not visit the Congress? And that purpose was to, because they were losing interest, to purchase this territory out here. And he could see the possibilities, and he wanted to urge the Congress to take position to push it to Louisiana country.
Yeah, good question. So the question was it part of Marcus Whitman's travel back to the U.S. in 1842 and 43 to talk to Congress and to encourage American expansion into this area? Listen, I'm paraphrasing your question. It was a very dangerous journey, right? In the 1840s, you probably, in the fall and winter, you would not want to be traveling across the continent, so there were definitely a lot of perils for Marcus Whitman in that journey. And Marcus Whitman did stop by Washington, D.C. So his main purpose was to go to Boston, where the American Board was, where he could go and petition for that funding, right? Please keep funding us. On his way to Boston, he did briefly stop by Washington, D.C. Now, there is no record, there is nothing in the historical record that he met with the president or any of these big legislators to have those meetings. A lot of times, that idea, that concept is credited actually to Henry Spalding. Henry Spalding, after the death of Marcus Whitman, and the others here outside Walla Walla, Henry Spalding took a kernel of truth, right, that Marcus Whitman traveled back east in 1842 and 43, and that he did go to Washington, D.C. And Henry Spalding kind of wove a little bit, he got creative with it, right, and so he after Whitman's death, Spalding starts this story that Marcus Whitman met with the president back east and convinced the president that Britain was, lurking ominously and that the United States should act now to protect their claim to this area, to the Pacific Northwest. What we know is that there's nothing in the historic record that indicates that Marcus Whitman had any of those conversations in Washington, D.C. Marcus Whitman doesn't ever talk about it. No one in D.C. talks about it. So there's not much in the historic record to support that. However, after the death of the Whitmans, it was a really nice story, and people really like nice stories, right? And so it got a lot of popularity, and it got a lot of airtime, and it got a lot of widespread acclaim and acceptance. So he did stop by Washington, D.C., but he did not meet with any, he didn't meet with the president, and he didn't talk about what we often hear as saving Oregon for the United States. Yeah, good question. Sorry for the long answer. Here.
I read a book, I can't remember the name of it, but it really kind of defamed Marcus Whitman as being a not very nice person, especially toward his wife, as well as the Native Americans. And one of the things that they said is that when he went back to Boston in 42, that his wife begged him to get her a pair of glasses because she was literally going blind. And he refused and didn't bring that kind of thing. And just a general kind of a nasty person. Is that true that he was kind of that way, or would anybody know? Probably not.
It's hard to say. I mean, right, none of us ever interacted with him. I think what is fair to say about both Marcus and Narcissa Whitman is that they were humans, right? So a lot of times, humans have really great strengths and wonderful qualities. Like, that's true of every one of us. That's probably true of the Whitmans as well. They had good qualities, but as human beings, we all have faults, and we all have times when we get frustrated and lose our patience or get angry and upset. And I think that's true of the Whitmans as well. What I do know about the relationship between Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, I actually haven't heard the story about the glasses. I'm going to have to look that up, look into that. But what I do know is that they were, it was a rushed marriage, and it was so that they could both come out here as missionaries, because the board wouldn't send single missionaries. Certainly wouldn't send single women, but they did not like sending single men either. And there was kindness, or there was, a mutual respect, perhaps, but I don't know that they were head over heels in love with each other. I think it was more of that marriage of convenience. But again, it's hard to say, none of us being alive at the time. But yeah, it's a good question. In the back.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for a really fascinating presentation. I'm wondering if we have any indication if Narcissa was on board with this pivot in the work. Do we have any sense of that? If she initially also wanted to be a missionary?
It's a good question, and to be honest, it's not something I really looked into too much for this. So I don't have a great answer for you, but it's a great question. We do know that by this time, about halfway through the mission being out here, the Whitmans being out here, we do know that Narcissa Whitman, you can read it in her letters, she was feeling like extreme loneliness and a lot of disillusionment with, I think perhaps she had some really idealistic expectations of what it would be like, and I think that those expectations were not the reality. So we do know that there was a little bit of frustration and disillusionment, as well as a lot of loneliness. She writes back to her family, like her parents and her sisters, really, really lonely, and after the death of their child, this intensifies. So I don't know what her thoughts were, but it's a good question. It's one I'll look into. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, the sale part of the legacy by your Whitman College grad.
I am.
As a promotion, the man in State of Oregon raised all the money for your alma mater at one time. I was wondering how you think that fits in the legacy versus tree?
It's a good question. I will say when I was a student at Whitman, I started out as a seasonal ranger out at Whitman Mission. And I was there 2 summers while I was a student at Whitman. And so I knew a little bit about this. I've learned a lot more since being there full time, and like now it's my career. So I will say I've been more invested since coming back full time than I was when I was a student and a seasonal park ranger. But you know what you're alluding to is Stephen Penrose and this campaign, this fundraising campaign to kind of save Whitman College and create this big endowment that still funds the college today. And Stephen Penrose used this, what we sometimes call the Whitman myth, right? The Whitman saved Oregon story. Stephen Penrose used that story to really drum up a ton of financial support for Whitman College, because Whitman College is named after Marcus Whitman. I think that when I was a student, not many Whitman College students were engaging with this history. So I graduated in 2013. When I was a student there, most of my peers, the people who, you know, my friends, they were like, oh, you know, who are these people? What did they do? So there wasn't a whole lot of engagement with the history, either of the college or of the Whitmans. What I've seen since coming back to Walla Walla and being in this role is that now, today, in 2024, there's way more engagement in the student body at Whitman College to have conversations about this history, about Penrose, about how the college has used Marcus Whitman's legacy, either in some people's opinion in a good way, and in other people's opinion in a not good way, right? And how do you grapple with that? So I think that anytime people are talking about people or events of the past, right, we see relevance in that. Whether you agree or disagree with the people, with the actions, with the events, we can learn a lot from what was going on then. So to me, I'm just happy that people are engaging with the history, whether they, you know, whether it's in a positive or a negative way, right? Once we start that engagement, we can see relevance, and then we can see lessons, and we can see that interest. So, good question. Anyone else? Well, again, oh, yeah, one more.
So, you're talking about disillusionment. I mean, it almost seemed presumptuous to me that you had these people coming from Boston, they came out and basically told the people that were already there that their culture was inadequate and they ought to follow us. And I would assume that the people that were already there thought that their culture was fine and things, why the hell did they want to make any change and all of that. And so after a while I could see the Whitmans getting frustrated, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, got these people coming on the Oregon Trail, and you're the only store in town. You know, it's going to be really hard to say, oh, I'm going to sit here and be a missionary toward these people when I can. I mean, you were alluding to that. We probably still haven't done that much. So.
Yeah, you're right. So there's this shift in purpose. The Whitmans, we see this shift in purpose, their focus, right? They shift away from missionary work towards business, supplying Oregon Trail immigrants. And I think that no matter how you feel about the Whitmans, right, what I would encourage you to think about, what I would hope this talk did was encourage you to reevaluate how we think about people's legacy, right? Because you never hear about business when you hear about Marcus Whitman. No matter how you feel about him, right? I'm trying to just kind of plant a little seed to make you think, like maybe there's more I don't know about Marcus Whitman or other historic figures. Now, I do think that one of the frustrations with this shift from the residents, right, the long-term residents here, Cayuse, Walla Walla, Umatilla people, one of those frustrations was Marcus Whitman was outside of his country. He was in someone else's country. And he arrived here saying, you know, we're gonna teach you things. Like, we have these new technologies, or this new source of power, this new religion, we want to share. And halfway through his time here, he's still living outside of his country. He's still living in someone else's country, but he's not doing that, his end of the bargain anymore. And so I think that's where some of those frustrations started to bubble up. Was, you know, this shift, it takes him away from what he said he was going to do here. So now he's doing something different.
So there are two newer books in the last few years, Martyred Mission and Unsettled Ground. Could you comment on those, your opinion?
Yeah, sure. There's a third one too, as well. It's called Providence and the Invention of American History. It's definitely like the most academic. So it's written by a historian. I would say it's maybe a tiny bit more dry. That's not throwing shade on academia, but it is more academic, right? So it's just a little bit slower to get through than the other two. So they're all three good. I've read all three of them. A few years ago, Whitman College and Muslim Cultural Institute hosted two of the authors, Sarah Coney, who's the author of the Providence book, and then Blaine Hardin, the author of Murder at the Mission. And there was a series of talks and Q&As and all kinds of interesting things, so I got to chat with both of those authors, and it was really nice. We do sell all three of those books at our bookstore in the Visitor Center. And I think they all have their own place, right? They all have a slightly different take, and they're all valuable in their own way. I'll start out with Unsettled Ground, which was by Cassandra Tate. Unsettled Ground, I think, is a really good overview from multiple perspectives of the mission and the history. One thing I really like about Unsettled Ground is the author really stays here in the Walla Walla Valley, right? Really stays here with this story. And she also brings the story up to today, to conversations about like the statue I was just showing on the screen a few minutes ago. So it's a really nice book. It's a good summary from multiple perspectives. It's not too long. It's a good overview. It's a good one. Murder at the Mission is by Blaine Hardin, and that one is also a good book. I've read it. We sell it. And Murder at the Mission does have some summary of like the mission and the missionaries and what was going on here. But Murder at the Mission goes on a little bit more, goes a little bit further from here, because it talks a lot about Henry Spalding. And it talks a lot about Henry Spalding and William Gray and this legacy that was created for Marcus Whitman after his death. And that's that he, saved Oregon from the British. And so it talks about that, and it talks a lot about conflict between Spalding and Gray, the Protestants, with the Catholic priests who were here. So if you're really interested in that, it goes on some really interesting, tangents and rabbit holes around that. Providence is another good one, Sarah Coney. Like I said, it's the most academic, and so her take is looking at the history of the Whitman myth, right, this story, Whitman saved Oregon, that myth, and how it was created and then disproven. But her book is more about the idea of providence, or divine providence, which is this concept that a spiritual being, God, has a direct role in how actions take place. So God is an actor in how history happens. Okay, so that's the idea of divine providence. And her book looks at and uses the Whitman example to look at how providence, this idea of divine providence, made its way into the early fledgling field of American history. So equally good, just a little bit different, right? So they're all a little different. They complement, and they do overlap each other in some ways, but if you're really interested in the topic, it's worth reading all three. All right. One more question, and then we'll probably have to wrap up.
So you had the Hudson Bay Company, and you had the P, and that group both predated Whitman by quite a while, and also integrated into the local community much better than Whitman ever did. And it's always been surprising to me that there's very little interest or very little talk, discussion about pre-Whitman Whitman non-natives?
Yeah, it's a good observation. Trappers and traders established the original Fort Walla Walla there on the Columbia River in 1818. Someone at the back at Fort Walla Walla. Did I get that year right? Great, thank you. So there was consistent presence by other white people, whether they were French Canadian, whether they were British, whether they were American. There was consistent presence in this area by white people from 1818 onward. That's almost 20 years before the Whitmans arrived. So for 20 years, there's this consistent presence. And many of the trappers and traders were French Canadian, they were French speaking under the flag of the British government. And many of them married Walla Walla and Cayuse women and established what we would call Métis families, mixed race, and that's a lot of what Frenchtown talks about. And one of the really interesting things at Whitman Mission in this history is the conflict and almost the discord between the Whitmans, who were Presbyterian, who were Protestant, and some of the families, the French-speaking, predominantly Catholic Métis families. And because of the difference in religion, the Catholic and the Protestant, there actually wasn't much overlap between the Whitmans when they were here and many of those Frenchtown families. There was a lot of really, really vehement dislike between Catholics and Presbyterians at that time. So there's not a ton of interaction, but it is a good point, and it's something that I think is really, you can look at the Catholic priests who are doing missionary work out here, and you can look at the Presbyterians who are doing missionary work out here, vastly different outcomes. And I think it's an interesting side tangent for sure.
Well, both of those religions had a certain antipathy for the other that predated the church.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the folks who were Catholic or Presbyterian here kind of inherited that dislike of the other.